Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking at what I honestly think is one of the most fascinating historical paradoxes out there. I mean, think about this for a second. How does a heavily persecuted minority religious movement in the ancient Roman Empire somehow transform into an institutional superpower? And not just for a little while, but dominating a whole continent for over a millennium. It's kind of like a banned underground club suddenly becoming the government for 1,000 years. That's the wild 2,000-year life cycle of Christianity in Europe. So let's just dive right into this.
So, how exactly did a small first-century movement become the defining power of Europe? That's the central question we're unpacking today. And to really get it, we can't just look at this history as some boring, static timeline of dates and names. We have to see it for what it was, a continuous, highly dramatic metamorphosis. This is a story of constant adaptation. We're talking going from moments of total absolute unity to explosive fragmentation, and ultimately to just complete cultural transformation.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the unlikely rise from movement to empire, then move into the medieval supremacy. After that, we'll examine the splinters, Reformation, and fracture, track the shift from the Enlightenment to modern secularization, and finally wrap up with the future of faith.
All right, Part 1, From Movement to Empire and the Unlikely Rise. We're starting our journey in the 1st century Roman province of Judea. And just to set the scene, this was an era where the early followers of Jesus Christ faced intense, brutal persecution, basically just because they absolutely refused to worship Roman gods or the emperor.
What's truly staggering here is just the sheer speed of this transition. In the 1st century, Christians are these disruptive, hunted outsiders. But fast forward just a few centuries, and the entire script flips. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine actually legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan. Then, literally 12 years later, in 325 AD, you get the Council of Nicaea. This was a massive turning point where church leaders got together, established foundational doctrines, and centralized their theology. And then boom, 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire falls. But as we're going to see, the religion doesn't fall with it.
So why did it spread so incredibly fast, especially when being a member could literally get you executed? Well, historians point to 3 main pillars. First, they had a really strong, tight-knit community structure that actively supported its members. Second, their moral teachings focused heavily on equality and salvation, which, as you can imagine, appealed deeply to the everyday masses. And third, you had the tireless, on-the-ground missionary work by early followers, like Paul. You put those 3 elements together, and you get a movement that just couldn't be stamped out by imperial decrees.
Moving into Part 2, the medieval supremacy and the unifying force. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Europe basically spiraled into a highly unstable, fragmented mess. But Christianity didn't fade away. Instead, it adapted, and it became the absolute unifying force of the entire continent.
You might be wondering, how exactly did the church fill that massive power vacuum left by Rome? Well, they pulled off 3 brilliant adaptations. Number 1, monasteries stepped up to preserve knowledge and literacy. They basically became the intellectual hubs of a broken world. Number 2, without a centralized Roman government around, bishops stepped in to become essential political and social leaders in their communities. And number 3, Latin was strictly maintained as the absolute language of both education and religion. Because of these strategic moves, the church grew into the ultimate political, economic, and cultural superpower of the Middle Ages.
Now, having that level of absolute supremacy brought immense ambition, and that really culminated in the Crusades, running from 1095 to 1291. This was a series of up to 9 major religious wars initially launched to reclaim Jerusalem. And the historical outcomes here are deeply, deeply complex. On one hand, they unified large chunks of Europe under a shared goal, vastly increased cultural exchange between East and West, and genuinely expanded human knowledge and trade networks. But on the other hand, they starkly revealed the devastating dangers of religious conflict and the political manipulation of faith. It really is one of the most multifaceted turning points in this whole story.
Okay, Part 3, Splinters, Reformation, and Fracture. Because honestly, if history teaches us anything, it's that absolute institutional power rarely lasts without sparking some serious internal demands for reform. And the unified medieval church was about to face some monumental internal tensions.
The first massive crack in the foundation was the Great Schism of 1054. Europe was literally split in 2. Over in the West, you have the Roman Catholic Church, highly centralized under the authority of the Pope. But in the East, the Byzantine Empire aligned with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this division was driven by distinct theological interpretations and really profound cultural differences. This wasn't just some temporary disagreement either. This permanently fractured the European religious map into two major, distinct branches.
But an even larger seismic shift was just around the corner. Enter the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. You could easily argue this was the most transformative moment in all of Christian history. Sparked by figures like Martin Luther, this movement boldly, directly challenged Catholic Church practices. A huge sticking point was the selling of indulgences, which was essentially allowing wealthy people to buy a literal ticket to heaven and get forgiveness for their sins. It was a massive, unprecedented challenge to the default operating system of Europe.
And the fallout from the Reformation was just staggering. First off, Christianity fractured yet again, splitting Western Europe violently into Catholic and Protestant branches. Second, this division triggered decades of absolutely devastating religious wars all across the continent. But third, and this is crucial, it forged a new reality where national identities became permanently linked with specific religious affiliations. Unified control was completely shattered. Though, interestingly enough, this period also birthed much higher literacy rates, mostly because of new Bible translations, and it sparked the whole idea of individual interpretation.
Which brings us to 1648. Now, 1648 is a vital anchor point. The Peace of Westphalia ended the catastrophic 30 Years' War, and it introduced a really radical new idea. States could now actually choose their own religion. This shift effectively birthed the modern borders and nation-states that we recognize today. Christianity was no longer a single, unified, overarching authority. It was now a pluralistic system deeply woven into different competing national identities.
That takes us to part 4, Enlightenment to Modern Secularization. This marks a profound shift in authority. As we roll into the 18th century, the Enlightenment takes off, bringing rational thinking, philosophy, and the scientific method right to the forefront. And all of this heavily challenged traditional religious doctrines.
Which brings up a fascinating question for us to chew on as we bridge into the modern era. What actually happens when a dominant religion loses its political power? Seriously, think about it. How does an institution that spent well over 1,000 years building empires survive when society begins to actively secularize and place reason above ancient doctrine?
Well, the answer is adaptation. It morphs into a highly diverse landscape. If you look at secularized Western and Northern European nations today, religion has mostly become a sort of cultural heritage, heavily marked by declining church attendance. But conversely, in identity-focused nations, places like Poland, Hungary, Italy, or Ireland, Christianity still remains a highly visible, active marker of national identity and tradition. So it's no longer the absolute default system for the whole continent. Instead, it's evolved differently based on regional and national identity. And finally, part 5, the future of faith. We are solidly in the 21st century now, so let's look at the fascinating sociological shifts happening right at this very moment. Is the story of European Christianity simply just a story of inevitable decline? Well, according to the data, no, actually, it's not.
There are 4 really powerful trends shaping the modern story right now. First, yes, continued secularization. A lot of Western European societies will likely continue to see religion as less central to their daily lives. Second, while the overall numbers are definitely smaller, the remaining communities are incredibly committed. They're becoming much more active, tight-knit, and organized. Third, global migration is actively changing the demographics of the religion in Europe as we speak. And finally, number 4, there's the rise of what sociologists call cultural Christianity. This is a hybrid identity where a lot of Europeans might not identify as strictly, actively religious, but they still celebrate the holidays, get married in the church, and hold on to the cultural values.
Let's zoom in on migration for a second, because it is acting as a massive catalyst for change. Mass movement has drastically increased religious diversity across the board, bringing incredibly vibrant communities of Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism to Europe. But it is also transforming Christianity itself. We're seeing massive, dynamic growth in evangelical and Pentecostal urban churches right alongside new Catholic and Orthodox communities arriving from Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. It's literally making the religion more visibly global within Europe. Now, of course, this rapid change also fuels broader social and political debates regarding European values, integration, and what cultural identity even means today.
And that brings us to our final thought. The source material leaves us with this really powerful conclusion. The future of Christianity in Europe will likely not be defined by disappearance, but by transformation, from a persecuted first-century minority to a massive medieval superpower, pushing through the fractures of the Reformation all the way to the diverse, globally influenced, culturally embedded presence it is today. It really forces us to ask, as Europe continues to diversify and evolve, what shape will this 2,000-year-old movement possibly take next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.